A small town. A brutal crime. A teenage girl found barely alive at a construction site. The horror she endured would shock the world. Bredasdorp, South Africa. A place of quiet streets and familiar faces. A town where life moves in predictable rhythms, people work, children play, families gather at the end of the day. A town where violent crime feels distant, like something that happens in big cities, far from the open fields and quiet homes of this rural community. But in the early morning hours of February 2nd, 2013, something happened that changed everything. Something so horrific, so unthinkable, that even the most seasoned investigators would struggle to comprehend the depths of its cruelty. It began with a routine patrol. A security guard making his early morning rounds at a local construction site. It was supposed to be an uneventful shift, checking for trespassers, ensuring equipment was secure. But as he stepped onto the site, something caught his attention. A figure, barely visible in the dim light. A body, motionless, crumpled in the dirt. At first, he thought it was a drunkard who had passed out. Maybe someone who had gotten lost in the night, collapsing from exhaustion. But as he moved closer, his breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a person sleeping. This was something else. Something unimaginable. It was a girl. Barely recognizable. Her clothes torn, her body mutilated beyond reason. Blood pooled beneath her, soaking into the cold earth. Her injuries were beyond anything he had ever seen. And yet, somehow, she was still alive. Anine Booson. 17 years old. She had been left for dead in the most brutal way possible, abandoned in the dirt like she was nothing. But she wasn't nothing. She was still fighting. Clinging to the last shreds of life, defying the odds. When paramedics arrived, they struggled to comprehend the severity of what had been done to her. The damage was irreversible. She was slipping away. But before she lost consciousness, before the pain became too much to bear, she did something no one expected. She spoke. Her voice was weak, barely above a whisper. But the words she uttered would set off a chain reaction, an investigation that would shake the country. She gave a name. A single name. A name that police would seize upon. A name that would lead to an arrest. But was it the whole truth? Because as the investigation unfolded, disturbing details began to emerge. The timeline. The evidence. The statements. And the more people looked, the more questions they had. What really happened to Anine Booson that night? Who else knew the truth? And did justice truly prevail? 17 years. That's all the time Anine Booson had. She was born in Bredasdorp, a small town tucked away in South Africa's Western Cape. A place where people lived by routine. Where neighbors looked out for one another, but where struggle was woven into daily life. Jobs were few. Opportunities were scarce. And for many young girls, danger was always closer than it seemed. Anine's childhood was not easy. She had been raised by a foster mother, Corlia Olivier, who took her in and tried to provide a stable home. But like so many others in the town, Anine faced hardship. Life was tough, and the future was uncertain. Yet, despite the challenges, she had dreams. People who knew her say she was strong-willed. Determined. She had taken a job as a construction trainee, an unusual choice for a young woman, but she didn't care. She wanted to work. She wanted more for herself. But in South Africa, for women and girls, simply existing in certain spaces came with risk. The country has one of the highest rates of gender-based violence in the world. Every day, countless cases go unreported. Women disappear. Girls become statistics. And justice is often a fleeting promise. Anine had her whole life ahead of her. And yet, in just a few short hours, everything would change. February 1st, 2013. A Friday. The beginning of the weekend. It was summer, the air was warm, and the streets of Bredasdorp were alive with people heading out to unwind. For Anine, it was supposed to be a night like any other. A chance to relax, to enjoy time with friends. A chance to forget about the weight of everyday life, if only for a few hours. That evening, she went to TJ's pub, a local bar, a place she had been before. It was familiar. Comfortable. A spot where many in town gathered on weekends. Witnesses would later recall seeing her there, laughing, chatting, in good spirits. But who was there with her? Who did she talk to? And more importantly, who was watching her? Surveillance cameras captured parts of her night. The last recorded moments of her life before she stepped into the unknown. But a camera can only tell so much. It can show a person moving, smiling, interacting, but it can't capture intention. It can't capture what lingers beneath the surface. At some point, Anine left the bar. She walked out into the night, unaware that she would never return home. From that moment on, the timeline becomes unclear. Who did she leave with? Where did she go? And what happened in those final hours before she was found? What happened after she left the bar remains a chilling mystery. The morning of February 2nd, 2013, began like any other in Bredasdorp. But for one man, that morning would mark the start of something far beyond anything he could have imagined. A construction worker, arriving at the site to begin his day, noticed something strange as he approached the building. At first, it seemed like a discarded bundle of fabric. But as he got closer, he froze. It wasn't a bundle at all. It was a girl. A young girl, barely alive, lying motionless in the dirt, her body barely recognizable from the brutal violence she had suffered. Her clothes were torn. Her body was battered. She was barely breathing. Blood soaked into the ground, staining the dirt around her. The worker, horrified and frantic, called for help immediately. Paramedics arrived quickly, but the sight before them left even the most seasoned professionals in disbelief. Anine's injuries were horrific. She had been gang raped. Her abdomen was ripped open, her organs exposed to the elements. It was a level of brutality that shook the very core of those who witnessed it. But despite the severity of her wounds, Anine was still alive. Barely. They rushed her to the hospital, working against time. Every second counted. When she arrived, she was conscious, her body struggling to hold on. It was clear she had been through unimaginable pain. Yet, in the midst of it all, she managed to whisper a name. Johannes Kanner. Those two words would set the course of the investigation into motion. But her statement raised questions. Why would she say his name? Was it the truth? Or was there more to the story than anyone could know? Doctors and investigators who had seen their fair share of violent crimes were left shaken. They had never encountered a case this severe, this horrific. Anine's suffering was beyond comprehension. The brutality of the attack left even the most hardened professionals in disbelief. As the hours passed, Anine's condition worsened. Despite all efforts, she could not survive the damage done to her. She passed away, her last breath a reminder of the horror she had endured. But as the investigation began, one question lingered in the air. Was Johannes Kanner really the only person responsible? The name had been spoken, but the truth was far from clear. The police had their suspect, but the investigation was just beginning, and disturbing details were about to come to light. As the days passed, the investigation into Anine Boussen's brutal assault gained momentum. With the first key clue, a name whispered in her final moments, the police began to piece together a timeline, hoping to shed light on the mystery of what had truly happened that night. The name Johannes Kanner became central to the investigation. But where was he that night? Investigators immediately began tracking his whereabouts, speaking with anyone who could help answer that question. What did those who had been at the bar that night say? Was there anyone who could place him near the scene? The challenge, however, was that the area where Anine was found was disturbingly void of evidence. The construction site, dark and remote, had no security cameras nearby. The lack of footage only deepened the mystery. How could such a violent crime occur in an area with no surveillance? It was almost as though the attackers had known exactly where to strike, where to avoid being seen. But the absence of security footage wasn't the only obstacle investigators had to face. As they examined the crime scene further, the reality of the brutality began to sink in. Forensic experts carefully collected the evidence, hair, fibers, and other traces that could point to the perpetrators. And as the lab results came in, one thing became clear: this was not the work of a single attacker. DNA testing confirmed that there was more than one individual involved. Footprint analysis further suggested that multiple people had been present at the scene. The evidence pointed to a violent group assault. Then came the breakthrough: the arrest of Johannes Kanner. Kanner, a 22-year-old man from the area, was taken into custody. When questioned, he confessed. He admitted to raping Anine, recounting the brutal attack with chilling detail. But there was one key thing he denied: he denied killing her. According to him, he had left her alive at the scene, but someone else must have finished what he started. Kanner's story, however, didn't quite add up. His statements were inconsistent. His recollection of the night was full of contradictions. If he had truly left Anine alive, how could he explain the forensic evidence, the DNA that pointed to him as one of the attackers? Even with his confession, there were still so many unanswered questions. Was Kanner telling the truth? Or was he hiding something, or someone? With his admission, many believed the case had been solved. But something still didn't sit right. Had justice really been served, or was there more to the story than anyone realized? The trial of Johannes Kanner began under the glare of the media spotlight. This was not just another court case, it was the focal point of a community gripped by outrage. The horror of what had happened to Anine Boosen had struck a chord with the people of Bredasdorp, and it wasn't just local. This case was making headlines across South Africa. The brutality of her attack, the callousness of her assailants, had shocked the entire nation. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, holding signs, demanding justice for Anine. The community's anger was palpable. How could such a heinous act happen in a town where everyone knew each other? And yet, as the trial unfolded, questions began to emerge, questions that went far beyond Kanner's confession. The prosecution laid out a strong case. They had forensic evidence that placed Kanner at the crime scene. They had his confession, in which he admitted to the rape, describing the attack in harrowing detail. But the prosecution's case wasn't just about Kanner's words, it was about the evidence. The DNA. The multiple sets of footprints. The severity of Anine's injuries. Everything pointed to the involvement of more than just one person. But here was the problem: no one else was ever charged. Why had Anine suffered injuries that suggested multiple attackers? Why was there no mention of anyone else in the trial? Was she too injured to name her attackers? Or was something more sinister at play? Were other suspects protected, perhaps even by those who should have been bringing them to justice? As the trial progressed, the court was presented with the gruesome reality of Anine's injuries. The details of what she endured were difficult to process, but for many, they raised more questions than answers. Was Kanner the sole perpetrator? Or was he simply the scapegoat? The prosecution's case seemed airtight. The evidence was there. His confession was damning. But some couldn't shake the feeling that the truth of what had really happened to Anine was being buried, perhaps not intentionally, but because the full story was too dangerous, too ugly to tell. As the final arguments were made, the court delivered its verdict. Johannes Kanner was convicted. But for many, especially those who had followed the case closely, the feeling remained. The case had ended, but the truth felt incomplete. The court had made its decision, but the lingering question remained: was the full extent of justice really achieved? Was the case truly resolved, or was there more that no one was willing to expose? Johannes Kanner was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the brutal murder of Anine Boosen. The courtroom was filled with tension as the gavel fell. Kanner's face remained stoic as the judge delivered the sentence, but for those who had followed the case, the relief was overshadowed by the painful question: did the punishment fit the crime? For many, the answer was no. No sentence could truly match the horror Anine had endured. The justice that had been served felt incomplete, a bandage over a wound that could never fully heal. And for the community of Bredasdorp, and for all of South Africa, the echoes of Anine's suffering remained, a painful reminder of the systemic violence that plagued their society. The case had drawn significant attention to the widespread issue of gender-based violence in South Africa. Anine's story became a symbol, a rallying cry for those who had long been calling for change. Protests erupted across the nation as women's rights groups and concerned citizens demanded stricter laws, better protection, and justice for victims of violence. The impact of Anine's case extended beyond the courtroom. It exposed the dark reality that so many women in South Africa face daily: fear of assault, violence, and the tragic possibility of becoming another statistic. Gender-based violence in the country had reached staggering levels, with South Africa ranking as one of the most dangerous places in the world for women. But the fight didn't end with Kana's conviction. Anine's case was only one of many, and for every victim who received justice, countless others remained voiceless, their stories unheard. The cries for change grew louder, and the public began to demand systemic reform, but the road ahead was long. Anine's family, though devastated by the loss of their daughter, found solace in the fact that her death was not in vain. Her story sparked conversations about gender violence, inspiring a nationwide conversation about how to better protect the most vulnerable members of society. But the question remained: how much progress had really been made, and how much more needed to be done? South Africa has one of the highest rates of gender-based violence in the world. What can be done to stop cases like this? Let us know your thoughts. If you found this case as disturbing as we did, make sure to subscribe for more in-depth crime stories every week.